Let's jump right into this explainer and uncover the actual mechanics of government finance. We're going to completely map out the often misunderstood world of public debt. Whenever the national debt pops up on the news, it sounds absolutely terrifying, right? They make it sound like a gigantic credit card bill a country just casually rocked up. But as you're about to see, the reality of how governments borrow, manage, and repay money is entirely different from how you or I handle our own personal finances.
Today's agenda covers 6 key areas. First, defining public debt. Second, public versus private borrowing. Third, the sources and purposes of that debt. Fourth, the terms of repayment. Fifth, classifying debt by time. And finally, gross versus net debt.
Section 1. Defining public debt. Economist Finlay Shiras hit the nail on the head with his definition. Basically, public debt happens when a government's expenditure simply exceeds its revenue. When everyday taxes and fees just aren't enough to cover the big bills, the government has to borrow. They can do this internally from their own citizens or look abroad to other nations. And importantly, unlike tax revenue, which the government just gets to keep, this borrowed money absolutely must be paid back, and with interest.
Section 2. Public versus private borrowing.
Okay, this is where things get wild. The government can actually compel, literally force people and institutions to lend it money. Imagine trying to pull that off as a private citizen. You can't exactly knock on your neighbor's door and legally force them to hand over a loan, right? Private borrowing is 100% voluntary. But a sovereign government, it holds this unique overarching power of compulsion.
And if you thought compulsion was crazy, let's talk about repudiation. Under highly abnormal circumstances, a government can theoretically just refuse to pay back the loans it took from the public. Boom, just like that. Now, if a private citizen or a business tried to repudiate a debt, they'd immediately be hit with severe legal action in bankruptcy. But the government? Well, sometimes they can just change the rules of the game entirely.
Because of its massive creditworthiness, a government borrows at much lower interest rates than you or I ever could. But here's the real kicker. During a financial crisis, a government can even unilaterally reduce the interest rate it pays. A private borrower absolutely cannot do that. You can't just call your bank and say you're paying less this month. So you can see how these differences fundamentally change how we should be viewing national debt versus our own household budgets.
Section 3. Sources and purposes of debt.
So economists generally use 6 primary classifications for public debt. These 6 categories are basically our roadmap for the rest of the explainer. As you can see, debt is split into things like internal versus external, productive versus unproductive, and a few others. Let's go ahead and break these down one by one.
First up is productive debt. When the government borrows money for revenue-generating projects, think things like railways, major power plants, irrigation systems, or heavy steel industries, it is considered highly productive. And why is that? Well, because the income earned from these specific projects is actually enough to pay off both the principal loan amount and the interest. It basically pays for itself.
On the flip side, we have unproductive debt, which acts as a total dead weight on the economy. This happens when the government borrows to finance non-revenue items. We're talking about things like fighting a war or just plugging a general budgetary deficit. Because these loans don't add any productive capacity to the economy, they obviously don't generate the income needed to pay themselves back. And that makes them a much heavier burden on the taxpayers.
We also categorize debt by its source. Internal debt is raised right at home from citizens and institutions within the country. Now, the beauty of internal debt is that the nation's overall income remains exactly the same. The money is essentially just shifting pockets domestically. External debt, however, is a different story. That's borrowed from foreign countries or global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. This imposes a much greater domestic burden because paying that interest literally transfers a chunk of the country's national income abroad.
Now, while most public debt is voluntary, meaning citizens and banks are willingly buying up government bonds, governments can sometimes exert serious pressure to issue compulsory debt. During extreme emergencies, like a major war or severe inflation, the government might forcibly extract loans from the people. This is largely used as a tactic to reduce the sheer volume of purchasing power in the economy and cool down skyrocketing prices.
Section 4. Terms of repayment.
The crucial takeaway here is that governments strongly prefer redeemable debt. This is essentially a terminable loan where the government makes concrete arrangements to pay back the principal amount to the lenders after a fixed agreed-upon period of time. There's a very clear end date in sight. But then you have irredeemable debt, which means the principal amount is never actually refunded by the government. No way, right? Instead, the government just promises to pay regular interest on those loans in perpetuity.
Naturally, redeemable loans are the preferred route, since irredeemable ones seriously risk plunging a nation into a heavy, never-ending financial burden.
Now, if I put on my government financial planner hat for a second, the actual strategy behind repayment gets really fascinating. Let's look closely at funded versus unfunded debts. When we're talking about funded debt, we're dealing with long-term loans. These are big obligations maturing after a year or often much, much longer. So to ensure we can actually repay this massive amount upon maturity, the government creates a completely separate debt fund, which is commonly known as a sinking fund. You can think of it like a highly dedicated, untouchable savings account. The government strategically deposits a specific amount of money into this fund every single year, and it is strictly earmarked to repay the loan on maturity. It's methodical, it's organized, and it guarantees the capital is sitting there ready when the time comes. On the flip side, we have unfunded debt. These are strictly short-term loans, maturing in less than a year, and critically, there is no separate fund created for their repayment. A classic textbook example we use all the time in government finance: treasury bills. These are typically paid off super fast, usually in just 3 to 6 months. It's essentially a rapid liquidity fix for the government to manage its short-term needs rather than a long-term strategic commitment that requires a dedicated sinking fund.
Section 5. Classifying by time.
We basically classify debt into 3 simple buckets based on time. First, you have short-term or floating debts, like those treasury bills we just talked about, which last up to 1 year. Then, you've got medium-term public debts, which range from 1 to 5 years. And finally, anything extending beyond 5 years is firmly classified as long-term public debt.
Section 6. Gross versus net debt.
Gross debt is the grand sum total of all debts outstanding at any given time. This is that massive total liability number that usually flashes across the headlines and scares everybody. But net debt, that paints a much truer, more accurate picture of a country's actual financial health. Net debt is calculated by taking that massive gross debt and subtracting the assets the government already holds that are meant for repayment, like that sinking fund we discussed just a minute ago. So really, it's what the government actually owes after you account for the money it has already saved up to pay it back.
Which brings us to our final thought for today. Knowing what we know now, that governments play by entirely different rules, with the power to literally compel loans, potentially repudiate debt, lower interest rates at will, and manage perpetual borrowing through those sinking funds, we really have to ask ourselves, should we ever evaluate national debt the exact same way we do our own personal household finances? The mechanics we've explored today strongly suggest they are 2 entirely different worlds. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it gave you a powerful new perspective on how government finance truly operates.